Welcome. I'm glad you found your way here to this quiet corner of the world where we let the noise of the day fade into the background. Here, we don't just talk about what happened, we talk about how it felt, the weight of the air in the room, and the way a single sentence can tilt the axis of a person's entire life. If you're the kind of person who looks for the meaning between the lines, who understands that the most powerful stories are often the ones told in a whisper, then I think you'll feel at home here. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to stay a while. We're building a community of people who value the truth, no matter how much it stings. Take a moment to settle in. Maybe the house is quiet around you, or maybe you're seeking a bit of stillness in a busy world. I want to tell you about a night that redefined everything I knew about the man I shared a bed with, the home I had built, and the young man I had grown to care for as if he were my own. This isn't a story of grand explosions or cinematic betrayals. It is a story of shadows, of the things we choose not to see, and the way the truth eventually demands to be heard, even if it has to scream through the fog of a drunken haze. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my second chance at happiness turned into a lesson I never asked to learn. It began on a Friday in late October. In this part of the country, autumn doesn't just arrive, it settles in like a heavy, damp wool coat. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the windowpane of my workspace. I spend my days restoring old documents and historical records, fragile things that require a steady hand and a great deal of patience. There is something meditative about it, peeling back the layers of time, fixing the tears that history left behind. I suppose, looking back, I was so focused on fixing the past that I didn't realize my own present was beginning to fray at the edges. That evening, the house felt particularly large. It was one of those old craftsman-style homes with high ceilings and floorboards that groaned under the weight of a secret. Julian, my husband, was an urban planner, a man who literally designed the way people lived and moved. He was a man of structure, of blueprints and ironclad logic. When we married 4 years ago, that stability was exactly what I needed. My first marriage had been a whirlwind of unpredictability, a constant state of wondering which version of my husband would walk through the door. Julian was the opposite. He was the lighthouse in a storm I had been navigating for far too long. We met at a public hearing regarding the preservation of a local landmark. I was there as a consultant, and he was the lead architect. While others were arguing about budgets and zoning, Julian spoke about the soul of a building, about the memories held within its walls. He looked at me across the room, and for the first time in a decade, I felt like someone actually saw me. Not the divorcee Sarah, not the workaholic Sarah, but just me. Our first date was coffee in a rain-slicked downtown alleyway, and by the time we finished our second cup, I knew I was going to marry him. The first 2 years were what I imagine people mean when they talk about a golden period. Everything was synchronized. We had a rhythm that felt ancient and comfortable. Tuesday nights were for jazz and cooking something that took too many pans. Saturday mornings were for the farmer's market and long walks through the park where the mist clung to the trees. Julian was attentive, gentle, and always steady. He didn't just love me, he respected the quiet life I had built. Or so I thought. Julian's nephew, Leo, had come to live with us during his final years of university. Leo was a quiet kid, brilliant but shadowed. His parents, Julian's brother and sister-in-law, had passed away in a car accident when he was just a teenager, and Julian had stepped in to be his guardian. Leo didn't call me Aunt Sarah, and I didn't push for it. We had a silent agreement of mutual respect. He spent most of his time in the garage, which he'd converted into a makeshift workshop. He was always tinkering with something, an old radio, a broken clock, a lawnmower that hadn't run in years. I liked the sound of his work, the occasional clink of a wrench, the low hum of a sander. It made the house feel full. Sometimes I'd bring him a sandwich or a glass of iced tea, and we'd sit in the silence of the garage for 10 minutes, not saying a word, just watching the dust motes dance in the light of the workbench lamp. I felt like I was earning his trust in grams, a tiny bit every day. He was a boy who knew that the things you love can be taken away in an instant, so he guarded his heart with a wall of silence. But lately, that silence had changed. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a focused student anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a storm that refused to break. Leo stopped tinkering in the garage. He started coming home later and later, his eyes avoiding mine when we passed in the hallway. And he wasn't the only one. Julian, the man of routines, the man who prided himself on being home by 6:15 every evening, was becoming a ghost in his own house. It started with a few late nights at the office. "A new project," he'd say, his voice smooth and reassuring as he kissed the top of my head. "The city council is being difficult about the new transit hub." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that the foundation of our life was as solid as the buildings he designed. But then the late nights started happening 3-4 times a week. He'd come home after I was already in bed, the scent of the cold night air clinging to his coat, mixed with something else, a faint, sharp smell of expensive gin and a floral notes that didn't belong to any soap we owned. I lay awake those nights, listening to him brush his teeth, listening to the weight of his body as he climbed into bed beside me. I'd reach out a hand, touching his shoulder, and he'd go still. Not a pull away, but a freezing, like a deer sensing a predator. "Go back to sleep, Sarah," he'd whisper. "It's been a long day." The distance between us on that king-sized mattress felt like a canyon. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was I projecting the ghosts of my first marriage onto this one? Was I looking for cracks where there were none? That Friday in October, the rain was particularly relentless. Julian had called around 5 p.m. to say he'd be late again. A celebratory dinner with the developers, he claimed. I sat in my workshop, the lamp casting a pool of warm amber light over an 18th century ledger I was rebinding. The leather was dry and cracked, needing careful hydration. I felt a strange kinship with that old book. I felt dry. I felt like if someone handled me too roughly, I might just crumble into dust. I worked until 11 p.m., the house settling around me with its usual creaks and sighs. I had just finished cleaning my tools when I heard it. The heavy thud of the front door hitting the wall, not the polite, controlled click of Julian's key, but a violent, clumsy entrance. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the entryway. Leo was there. He was leaning against the coat rack, his chest heaving. His jacket was soaked through, the dark fabric clinging to his shoulders. Even from 5 feet away, the smell of cheap whiskey was overwhelming. It wasn't just on his breath, it seemed to be coming from his very pores. This was a boy who rarely finished a beer at dinner, yet here he was, barely able to stand. His hair was matted with rain, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated grief. "Leo?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Leo, what happened? Are you hurt?" He looked up at me, and I froze. His eyes were bloodshot. Yes, but there was a fire in them I had never seen before. A mixture of rage and a profound, bone-deep disappointment. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, turning into a wet, jagged cough. He pushed himself off the coat rack and stumbled into the kitchen, his boots leaving muddy, watery tracks across the hardwood floor I had polished just that morning. "Don't," he spat out, his voice raw. "Don't look at me like that, Sarah! Don't play the worried mother! We both know you're smarter than this!" I followed him, keeping my distance. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're drunk, Leo. Let me get you some water. Let's just sit down." He let out a laugh then, a sound so bitter it made my skin crawl. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the kitchen island to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. "Sit down? You want me to sit down in this house? In this museum of lies?" He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the framed photos of Julian and me on the wall. "He's not at a dinner, Sarah? He hasn't been at a dinner in months?" A coldness began to spread from the center of my chest, moving out toward my fingertips. I felt the air leave the room. "He's working, Leo. He's under a lot of pressure. Leo shook his head, a tear finally breaking free and tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He's been seeing her since the summer. I saw them, Sarah. I saw them at the old wharf project. In his car. In the middle of the day, like it didn't even matter. I thought if I fixed enough things in the garage, if I kept the house running, maybe he'd stop. Maybe he'd remember who he was supposed to be. I stood there, paralyzed. The rain continued to beat against the kitchen window, but inside, everything had gone silent. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash, before the screaming starts. I looked at Leo, really looked at him, and realized that his projects in the garage hadn't been about tinkering. They had been a desperate attempt to maintain control in a world that was falling apart. He had been carrying his uncle's secret like a bag of stones, and tonight, the weight had finally broken him. "He told me he'd take care of me," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "He told me he'd be better than my father was. But he's worse. He's a coward, Sarah. He's a coward who builds beautiful things so people won't notice the rot in the middle." Leo collapsed onto one of the kitchen stools, burying his face in his hands. He started to sob, not the loud, dramatic crying of a child, but the quiet, rhythmic shaking of a man who has lost his North Star. I didn't go to him. Not yet. I couldn't move. I was back in that rainy downtown alleyway, drinking coffee with Julian, feeling like I had finally found safety. I realized then that safety is often just a lack of information. I had been safe because I hadn't looked too closely at the blueprints. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Leo crying at the counter, me standing in the doorway of my own life, watching it dissolve. Eventually, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The clock on the microwave ticked over to 1 a.m., and then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The headlights swept across the kitchen wall, illuminating Leo for a brief, harsh second before disappearing. The front door opened. Julian walked in, humming a low tune. He looked tired, but his tie was still perfectly knotted. He saw the light in the kitchen and walked toward us, a smile already forming on his face. The practiced smile of a man who knows exactly how to manage a room. "Sarah, you're still up?" he said, his voice as smooth as velvet. Then he saw Leo. He saw the mud, the whiskey bottle Leo had tucked into his jacket, the devastation on my face. The smile didn't drop. It flickered like a light bulb about to burn out. "Leo, what is this?" Julian's voice took on a sharp, authoritative edge. "You're a mess. What have you been doing?" Leo didn't look up. He didn't have to. The silence in the room was doing all the talking. I looked at Julian, the man I had trusted with my second chance, and for the first time, I didn't see the lighthouse. I saw the architect. I saw a man who knew how to hide the cracks in the foundation with a fresh coat of paint and a convincing story. "He knows, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, calmer than I expected it to be. "And now, so do I." Julian didn't deny it. He didn't ask what I meant. He just stood there, the rain from his own umbrella dripping onto the floor, joining the puddle Leo had made. He looked from me to his nephew, and for a fleeting moment I saw the coward Leo had described. He looked small. He looked like a man who had built a life out of glass and was surprised when it finally shattered. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and legal documents. There was no screaming. Julian moved out 3 days later. He tried to explain, tried to talk about pressure and losing himself, but I wasn't interested in his blueprints anymore. I spent my time in my workshop, not fixing old ledgers, but just sitting in the silence. Leo stayed. For a while, at least. We spent a lot of time in the kitchen drinking tea and not talking about Julian. We talked about the rain. We talked about the books I was working on. We talked about the things he wanted to build once he finished his degree. He stopped drinking, and slowly, the light started to come back into his eyes. He started working in the garage again, but the sound was different. It wasn't frantic. It was the sound of a person building something new, something that didn't rely on anyone else's foundation. I realized that Leo coming home that night wasn't the tragedy I thought it was. It was a mercy. It was the truth arriving in the only way it could, unfiltered and painful but necessary. We often think of betrayal as the end of a story, but it's really just the moment the real story begins. The story of who we are when the person we trusted is no longer there to define us. I still live in that craftsman house. The floors still groan and the rain still drums against the windows. But the air feels lighter. I've started a new project, restoring a collection of letters from the 1920s, written by a woman who traveled across the country alone. Her words are full of uncertainty, but also a quiet, fierce independence. I find a lot of comfort in her pages. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear the clink of a wrench from the garage, and I'll know Leo is out there fixing something that was broken, and I'll sit in my workshop under the warm glow of my lamp, and I'll realize that I'm doing the same thing. We're all just restorers, I think. We spend our lives trying to fix the tears, trying to hydrate the parts of ourselves that have gone dry and brittle. It's not an easy process. It takes time, and the scars are always there if you know where to look. But a restored book is often stronger than a new one. It has history. It has survived. And there is a certain kind of beauty in that, the beauty of something that has been broken and then carefully, slowly put back together. I want to thank you for sitting with me tonight, for listening to the echoes of a house that learned how to breathe again. Life has a way of surprising us, of stripping away the things we thought were essential to show us what really matters. I've learned that the most important structures aren't the ones made of wood and stone, but the ones we build inside ourselves, the ones that can withstand even the heaviest rain. If this story brought up memories of your own, or if you've ever had a moment where the truth changed everything, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. We're all just trying to navigate the architecture of our lives, and it helps to know we're not doing it alone. Until next time, take care of your heart, pay attention to the silence, and remember that even in the dark, there is always a way to find your way home. Sleep well,